All right. Good evening, everyone. Hope you're doing well tonight. Tonight we're going to read through which chapter? Chapter 34 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This is not just going to be a typical reading. We're going to stop and talk about interesting vocabulary words as we encounter them. And if you're watching this live, because I'm doing this live, then please ask questions about vocabulary words or phrases that you don't understand or anything that isn't clear, and I'll be happy to go back and talk about those things. That's actually what makes the video interesting, is your questions, so I definitely encourage you to ask questions as we go. So let's get started with chapter 34 of David Copperfield. And the title of the chapter is My Aunt Astonishes Me. Astonish means surprise. My aunt surprises me. I wrote to Agnes as soon as Dora and I were engaged. I wrote her a long letter in which I tried to make her comprehend how blessed I was, and what a darling Dora was. I entreated Agnes not to regard this as a thoughtless passion which could ever yield to any other. When you yield to something, you give that other thing power. So when he says, my love would never yield to another person, it means I would never give the power of my love to another person. It's only for Dora. I entreated Agnes not to regard this as a thoughtless passion, which could ever yield to any other, or have the least resemblance to the boyish fancies that we used to joke about. I assured her that its profundity was quite unfathomable. To fathom something is to understand something. So if something is unfathomable, why can't I say that word? Unfathomable. It means it's impossible to understand it. So I assured her that that our love, the profundity, profound means deep. The profundity of our love, the deepness of our love was quite unfathomable. Why can't I say that word? Fathomable. Unfathomable. Impossible to understand, and expressed my belief that nothing like it had ever been known. Somehow, as I wrote to Agnes on a fine evening by my open window, the remembrance of her clear, calm eyes and gentle face came stealing over me. It shed such a peaceful influence upon the hurry and agitation in which I had been living lately, and of which my very happiness partook in some degree, that it soothed me to tears. I remember that I sat resting my head upon my hand when the letter was half done, cherishing it. When you cherish something, you enjoy and you love it very much. So it's like a combination of enjoying something but also feeling strong love for something. Cherishing a general fancy, as if Agnes were one of the elements of my natural home. As if in the retirement of the house, made almost sacred to me by her presence, Dora and I must be happier than anywhere. As if in love, joy, sorrow, hope, or disappointment, in all emotions, my heart turned naturally there and found its refuge and best friend. Of Steerforth, I said nothing. I only told her there had been a sad grief at Yarmouth on account of Emily's flight, and that on me it made a double wound by reason of the circumstances attending it. I knew how quick she always was to divine the truth. Divine is another word for guess, to guess the truth. and that she would never be the first to breathe his name. To this letter, I received an answer by return of post. As I read it, I seemed to hear Agnes speaking to me. It was like her cordial voice in many ears. What can I say more? While I had been away from home lately, Traddles had called twice or thrice. You know that once means one time and twice means... I changed the position of my camera. Now I'm trying to find the camera. You know that once means one time and twice means two times. And this word thrice means three times, but it's old. People don't use it anymore. If you say that word to people, native speakers, they'll understand you, but they'll probably laugh because it sounds very old to say thrice. Finding Peggotty within, and being informed by Peggotty, who always volunteered that information to whomsoever would receive it, that she was my old nurse, he had established a good-humored acquaintance with her, and had stayed to have a little chat with her about me. So Peggotty said, but I'm afraid the chat was all on her own side, and of immoderate length, as she was very difficult indeed to stop, God bless her, when she had me for her theme. So Davies may be worried that Peggotty says a little bit too much about him. But not because she's mean or gossipy. It's just that she loves talking about him. This reminds me not only that I expected Traddles on a certain afternoon of his own appointing, which was now come, but that Mrs. Crupp had resigned everything appertaining to her office, the salary excepted, until Peggotty should cease to present herself. Mrs. Crupp, after holding divers conversations respecting Peggotty in a very high-pitched voice on the staircase, with some invisible familiar, it would appear, for corporally speaking, she was quite alone at those times. So, now Mrs. Crupp, she does a very bad job keeping the house where Davy lives. She's supposed to do things like make food and clean, but she does a horrible job. She complains about how she doesn't feel well, and she's always drinking alcohol. And so Peggotty doesn't like her. And since Peggotty arrived, she's kind of taken over at least the care of Davy's apartment. But that's kind of insulting for Mrs. Crupp. So you can hear her complaining in the stairway or in the kitchen because it's sort of an insult that she can't do her work, even though she does a horrible job and she hates it. So she talks to herself. She was quite alone at those times, addressed a letter to me, developing her views. Beginning it with that statement of universal application which fitted every occurrence of her life, namely, that she was a mother herself, she went on to inform me that she had once seen the very different days, but that all periods of her existence she had had a constitutional objection to spies, intruders, informers. She named no names, she said, let them the cap-fitted wear it, but spies, intruders, and informers, especially in widow's weeds. This clause was underlined. So Mrs. Crupp is so insulted by Peggotty being there and taking charge of things that she wrote Davy a letter explaining that yet she understands that she used to be better before in the past when she was younger, but that's no reason. And she thinks Peggotty's a spy. So she says, that's no reason to have a spy watching me. An intruder is someone who comes in to a place unasked and unwelcomed, like Peggotty to her. She had ever accustomed herself to look down upon, if a gentleman was the victim of spies, intruders, and informers, but still naming no names, That was his own pleasure. He had a right to please himself. Let him do. So let him do. All that she, Mrs. Crupp, stipulated was that she should not be brought into contract. She should not be brought in contract with such persons. Therefore, she begged to be excused from any further attendance on the top set until things were as they formerly was, and as they could be wished to be, and further mentioned that her little book would be found upon the breakfast table every Saturday morning, when she had requested an immediate settlement of the same, with the benevolent viewing of saving trouble and an ill inconvenience to all parties. So Mrs. Crupp is saying, while Peggotty's here, I'm not going to do all the things I agreed to do because she's in the way. So fine, you can have her, but I'm not going to perform any of the duties I agreed to, but you still have to pay me. After this, Mrs. Crupp confined herself to making pitfalls on the stairs, principally with pitchers, and endeavoring to delude Peggotty into breaking her legs. I found it rather harassing to live in this state of siege, but was too much afraid of Mrs. Crupp to see any way out of it. "My dear Copperfield," cried Traddles, punctually appearing at my door, "in spite of all these obstacles, how do you do?" "My dear Traddles," said I, "I'm delighted to see you at last, and very sorry I have not been at home before, but I have been so much engaged." Yes, I know," said Traddles, "of course. Yours lives in London, I think." "What did you say?" Excuse me, Miss D, you know," said Traddles, colouring it in his great delicacy, "lives in London, I believe." "Oh, yes, near London." "Mine, perhaps you recollect," said Traddles, with a serious look, "lives down in Devonshire. One of 10, consequently, I am not so much engaged as you, in that sense." "I wonder you can bear," I returned, "to see her so seldom." "Ha!" said Traddles, thoughtfully. "Does not seem a wonder. I suppose it is." "It does seem a wonder. I suppose it is, Copperfield, because there's no help for it." "I suppose so," I replied with a smile, and not without a blush. "And because you have so much constancy and patience, Traddles." "Dear me," said Traddles, considering about it. "Do I strike you in that way, Copperfield?" You know, this word "to strike," which means like to hit something, can also mean it gives me the impression. So if I say, "You strike me as an honest person," that means you give me the impression that you're an honest person. I don't know for sure, but that's the energy that I get from you. So here he says, "Do I strike you in that way? Do I strike you as..." What did... Oh, Davy says he's very patient, and he's very consistent. And Traddles says, "Do I strike you that way? Do I give you that impression? Is that what you think of me?" Really, I didn't know that I had. But she is such an extraordinarily dear girl herself, that it's possible she may have imparted something of those virtues to me. Now you mention it, Copperfield, I shouldn't wonder at all. I assure you, she is always forgetting herself and taking care of the other 9. "Is she the eldest?" I inquired. "Oh dear, no," said Traddles. "The eldest is a beauty." He saw, I suppose, that I could not help smiling at the simplicity of this reply, and added with a smile upon his own ingenious face, "Not, of course, but that my Sophie, pretty name, Copperfield, I always think." "Very pretty," said I. "Not, of course, but that Sophie is beautiful too, in my eyes, and would be one of the dearest girls that ever was in anybody else's, I should think." But when I say the eldest is a beauty, I mean she really is a... He seemed to be describing clouds about himself with both hands. Splendid, you know, said Traddles energetically. Indeed, said I. Oh, I assure you, said Traddles, something very uncommon indeed. Then you know, being formed for society and admiration of their limited means, she naturally gets a little irritable and exacting sometimes. Sophie puts her in good humor. Is Sophie the youngest? I hazarded. Oh, dear, no, said Traddles, stroking his chin. The youngest are only 9 and 10. Sophie educates them. The second daughter, perhaps, I hazarded. No, said Traddles, Sarah's the second. Sarah has something the matter with her spine, poor girl. The malady, which will wear out by and by, the doctors say, but in the meantime she has to lie down for a 12-month. Sophie nurses her. Sophie's the fourth. Is the mother living? I inquired. Oh, yes, said Traddles. She's alive. She's a very superior woman indeed, but the damp country is not adapted to her constitution. And, in fact, she has lost the use of her limbs. Limbs are the extended parts of the body. So the arm, this is a limb. The legs are limbs. So if Traddles is saying the mother doesn't have use of her limbs, that means she can't use her arms or her legs. Dear me, I said. Very sad, is it not? Returned Traddles. But in a merely domestic view, it's not so bad as it might be, because Sophie takes her place. She is quite as much a mother to her mother as she is to the other 9. I felt the greatest admiration for the virtues of this young lady, and honestly, with the view of doing my best to prevent the good nature of Traddles from being imposed upon, to the detriment of their joint prospects in life, inquired how Mr. Micawber was. Oh, he's quite well, Copperfield, thank you, said Traddles. I'm not living with him at present. No? No, you see, the truth is, said Traddles in a whisper, he had changed his name to Mortimer in consequence of his temporary embarrassments. And he don't come out till after dark, and then in spectacles. So Mr. Micawber has changed his name to Mortimer, and he only goes out at night wearing a disguise. Spectacles, by the way, are glasses. There was an execution put into our house for rent. Mrs. Micawber was in such a dreadful state that I really couldn't resist giving my name to that second bill we spoke of here. You may imagine how delightful it was to my feelings, Copperfield, to see the matter settled with it, and Mrs. Micawber recover her spirits. I said. Not that her happiness was of long duration, pursued Traddles, for unfortunately, within a week, another execution came in. It broke up the establishment. I've been living in a furnished apartment since then, and the Mortimers have been very private indeed. I hope you won't think it selfish, Copperfield, if I mention that the broker carried off my little round table with the marble top and Sophie's flower pot and stand. What a hard thing, I exclaimed indignantly. It was a pull, said Traddles with his usual wince at the expression. Wincing is when something is painful. You make a face of pain. It's wincing. Ow! The fact is, Copperfield, I was unable to repurchase them at the time of their seizure. In the first place, because the broker, having an idea that I wanted them, ran the price up to an extravagant extent. And in the second place, because I hadn't any money. Now, I have kept my eye since upon the broker's shop, said Traddles, with a great enjoyment of his mystery, which is up at the top of Tottenham Court Road. And at last, today, I find them put it out for sale. I have only noticed them from over the way, because if the broker saw me, bless you, he'd ask any price for them. What has occurred to me, having now the money, is that perhaps you wouldn't object to ask that good nurse of yours to come in with me to the shop. I can show it to her from round the corner of the next street, and make the best bargain for them, as if they were for herself, that she can. The delight with which Traddles propounded this plan to me, and the sense he had of its uncommon artfulness, are among the freshest things in my remembrance. I told him that my old nurse would be delighted to assist him, and that we would all three take the field together, on one condition. That condition was that he should make a solemn resolution to grant no more loans of his name or anything else to Mr. Micawber. Oh, my dear Copperfield, said Traddles, I've already done so, because I begin to feel that I have not only been inconsiderate, but that I have been positively unjust to Sophie, my word being passed to myself. There is no longer any apprehension, but I pledge it to you, too, with the greatest readiness. The first unlucky obligation I have paid, I have no doubt Mr. Micawber would have paid it if he could, but he could not. One thing I ought to mention, which I like very much in Mr. Micawber, Copperfield. It refers to the second obligation, which is not yet due. He don't tell me that it is provided for, but he says it will be. Now, I think there's something very fair and honest about that. I was unwilling to damp my good friend's confidence, and therefore assented. After a little further conversation, we went round to the chandler's shop to enlist Peggotty, Traddles declining to pass the evening with me, both because he endured the liveliest apprehensions that his property would be bought by somebody else before he could repurchase it, and because it was the evening he always devoted to writing to the dearest girl in the world. I shall never forget him peeping round the corner of the street at Tottenham Court Road, while Peggotty was bargaining for the precious articles, or his agitation when she came slowly towards us, after vainly offering a price, and was hailed by the relenting broker, and went back again. The end of the negotiation was that she bought the property on tolerably easy terms, and Traddles was transported with pleasure. I'm very much obliged to you indeed, said Traddles, on hearing it was to be sent to where he lived that night. If I might ask one other favor, I hope you would not think it absurd, Copperfield. I said beforehand, certainly not. Then if you would be good enough, said Traddles to Peggotty, to get the flower pot now, I think I should like, it being Sophie's, Copperfield, to carry it home myself. Peggotty was glad to get it for him, and he overwhelmed her with thanks, and went his way up Tottenham Court Road, carrying the flower pot affectionately in his arms, with one of the most delighted expressions of countenance I ever saw. Remember, we've seen that word countenance before, and that means like the facial expression that you have, kind of the reflection of your feelings on your face. We then turned back towards my chambers, as the shops had charms for Peggotty which I never knew them possess in the same degree for anybody else. I sauntered easily along, amused by her staring in at windows and waiting for her as often as she chose. We were thus a good while in getting to the Adelphi. If something is a good while, that means it takes a long time, kind of a long time. So because Peggotty wanted to stop at all the shops and look in the windows, it took a much longer time than normal to get home. So it took a good while to get to the Adelphi. That's a pretty common expression, actually. On our way upstairs, I called her attention to the sudden disappearance of Mrs. Crupp's pitfalls, and also to the prints of recent footsteps. We were both very much surprised, coming higher up, to find my outer door standing open, which I had shut, and to hear voices inside. We looked at one another without knowing what to make of this, and went into the sitting room. What was my amazement to find of all people on earth my aunt there, and Mr. Dick. My aunt, sitting on a quantity... I'm trying to get the... I moved my camera up. Sitting on a quantity of luggage, with her 2 birds before her, and her cat on her knee, like a female Robinson Crusoe, drinking tea. Mr. Dick, leaning thoughtfully on a great kite, such as we had often been out together to fly, with more luggage piled about him. "My dear aunt," I cried, "what an unexpected pleasure!" We cordially embraced, and Mr. Dick and I cordially shook hands, and Mrs. Crupp, who was busy making tea and could not be too attentive, cordially said she had knowed well, as Mr. Copperfield would have his heart in his mouth than see his dear relations. "Hello," said my aunt to Peggotty, who quailed before her awful presence. "How are you?" "You remember my aunt, Peggotty," said I. "For the love of goodness, child," exclaimed my aunt, "don't call the woman by that South Sea Island name." She hates that name, Peggotty. If she married, got rid of it, which is one of the best things she could do. Why don't you give her the benefit of the change? What's your name now? P? Said my aunt as a compromise for the obnoxious appellation. Barkis, ma'am, said Peggotty with a curtsy. Well, that's human, said my aunt. It sounds less as if you wanted a missionary. How do you do, Barkis? I hope you're well. Encouraged by these graceful words, and by my aunt's extending her hand, Barkis came forward and took the hand and curtsied her acknowledgments. We are older than we were, I see, said my aunt. We have only met each other once before, you know. A nice business we made of it then. Trot, my dear, another cup. I handed it dutifully to my aunt, who was in her usual inflexible state of figure, and ventured a remonstrance with her on the subject of her sitting on a box. Let me draw the sofa here, or the easy-chair, aunt, said I. Why should you be so uncomfortable? Thank you, Trot, replied my aunt. I prefer to sit upon my property. Here my aunt looked hard at Mrs. Crupp and observed, We needn't trouble you wait, ma'am. So, the aunt has something to tell Davy, and Mrs. Crupp standing there is kind of annoying because it's none of her business. So she's saying, we don't need you. Go away. Shall I put a little more tea in the pot afore I go, ma'am? Said Mrs. Crupp. No, thank you, ma'am, replied my aunt. Would you let me fetch another pat of butter, ma'am? Said Mrs. Crupp. Or would you be persuaded to try a new laid egg? Or should I brile a rasher? Ain't there nothing I could do for you, dear aunt, Mr. Copperfield? Nothing, ma'am, returned my aunt. I shall do very well, I thank you. Mrs. Crupp, who had been incessantly smiling to express sweet temper, and incessantly holding her head on one side. Incessantly means it doesn't stop. Cease means stopping. So if something is incessant, it means it doesn't stop. So she was smiling the entire time, holding her head like this, incessantly rubbing her hands to express a desire to be of service of all deserving objects, gradually smiled herself, one-sided herself, and rubbed herself out the room. "Dick," said my aunt, "you know what I told you about time-servers and wealth-worshippers." Mr. Dick, with rather a scared look on his face, as if he had forgotten it, returned a hasty answer in the affirmative. "Mrs. Krupp is one of them," said my aunt. "Barkis, I'll trouble you to look after the tea and let me have another cup, for I don't fancy that woman's pouring out." I knew my aunt sufficiently well to know that she had something of importance on her mind, and that there was far more matter in this arrival than a stranger might have supposed. I noticed how her eye lighted on me, and when she thought my attention otherwise occupied, and what a curious process of hesitation appeared to be going on within her. While she preserved her outward stiffness and composure, I began to reflect whether I had done anything to offend her. And my conscience whispered me that I had not yet told her about Dora. Could it by any means be that? I wondered. So Davy knows that something is wrong. He knows that his aunt is there for some strange reason. And now he's thinking, oh, maybe she found out about his secret love, Dora, who he's now secretly engaged to. And now he's thinking, oh no, she's mad at me for keeping this secret from her. As I knew she would only speak in her own good time, if you do something in your own time, that means nobody can make you do it until you want to do it, until you feel like doing it. So there would be no reason to ask her, what's happening? What do you want? What's going on? Because she would only talk when she was ready to talk. So there's no reason to ask. As I knew she would only speak in her own good time, I sat down near her and spoke to the birds and played with the cat, and she was as easy as I could be, and was easy as I could be. But I was very far from being really easy. And I should still have been so, even if Mr. Dick, leaning over the great kite behind my aunt, had not taken every secret opportunity of shaking his head darkly at me and pointing to her. So Mr. Dick is standing behind her going, kind of maybe indicating that something is wrong. "Trot," said my aunt at last when she had finished her tea, and carefully smoothed down her dress and wiped her lips. "You needn't go, Barkis. Trot, have you got to be firm and self-reliant?" "I hope so, Aunt." "What do you think?" inquired Miss Betsy. "I think so, Aunt." "Then why, my love," said my aunt, looking earnestly at me, "why do you think I prefer to sit upon this property of mine tonight?" I shook my head, unable to guess. "Because," said my aunt, "it's all I have. Because I am ruined, my dear. If the house and every one of us had tumbled out into the river together, I could hardly have received a greater shock." "Dick knows it," said my aunt, laying her hand calmly on my shoulder. "I'm ruined, my dear Trot. All I have in the world is in this room, except the cottage, and that I have left Janet to let. To let something is to rent something. So she left her servant in... where are they from? I don't even remember anymore. Yarmouth, I guess? I can't remember anymore. But she left her servant there to try to rent her cottage, to try to rent her house for money. "I want to get a bed for this gentleman tonight, to save expense. Perhaps you can make up something here for myself. Anything will do. It's only for tonight. We'll talk about this tomorrow." We'll talk about this more tomorrow. I was roused from my amazement and concern for her, I'm sure for her, by falling on my neck for a moment and crying that she only grieved for me. In another moment she suppressed this emotion, and said with an aspect more triumphant than dejected, "We must meet reverses boldly, and not suffer them to frighten us, my dear. We must learn to act the play out. We must live misfortune downtrot." So she's the one who's lost everything, and Davy is crying, not because she lost everything, but because in all of this she only seemed to be concerned about him. And the way his aunt responded was, "Come on, don't cry. We have to be brave and strong to get through this." Well, that was a very short chapter. That was only half an hour. So I think we have to read chapter 35 as well, because that wasn't long enough. So, but before we do, I'm going to take a break. So I will be right back in 1 minute. Okay, thank you for waiting. We're back. So let's read chapter 35, which is entitled Depression. As soon as I could recover my presence of mind, which quite deserted me in the first overpowering shock of my aunt's intelligence. Intelligence here means information, new information. So it doesn't mean being smart. Intelligence means giving information, sharing information. And think about the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. It's not about being smart. It's about finding information and sharing information. I proposed to Mr. Dick to come round to the chandler's shop and take possession of the bed which Mr. Peggotty had lately vacated. The chandler's shop being at Hungerford Market, and Hungerford Market being a very different place in those days. There was a low wooden colonnade before the door, not very unlike that before the house where the little man and woman used to live, in the old weather glass. I'm not sure what he's talking about here. Which pleased Mr. Dick mightily. The glory of lodging over the structure would have compensated him, I dare say, for many inconveniences. But as there were only few to bear, beyond compound flavors I have already mentioned, that perhaps the want of a little more elbow room, he was perfectly charmed with his accommodation. Elbow room means room to move. So if you need more elbow room, it means things are too close. You're in a very confined area. To have elbow room means room to move around. So Mr. Dick really liked the room that Davy found for him, with one problem. There really wasn't a lot of elbow room. It was a small room, not a lot of room to move. Mrs. Krupp had indignantly assured him that there wasn't room to swing a cat in there, but Mr. Dick just observed to me, sitting down on the foot of the bed, nursing his leg, "You know, Trotwood, I don't want to swing a cat. I never do swing a cat." So this is an expression. I guess it's kind of a rude expression. Swinging would mean like this. So if somebody wants to say that something is too small, that there isn't a lot of elbow room, they'll say there isn't enough room to swing a cat. But Mr. Dick, he's not very smart. He has learning disabilities. And he says, "But I don't want to swing a cat." Mrs. Krupp is saying, "That's a small room. You can't even swing a cat in that room." And Mr. Dick says, "But I don't want to swing a cat. I never swing a cat." Therefore, what does it signify to me? I tried to ascertain whether Mr. Dick had any understanding of the causes of this sudden and great change in my aunt's affairs. As I might have expected, he had none at all. The only account he could give of it was that my aunt had said to him the day before yesterday, "Now, Dick, are you really and truly the philosopher I take you for?" That he had said yes, he hoped so. That then my aunt had said, "Dick, I'm ruined." That then he had said, "Oh, indeed." And that my aunt had praised him highly, which he was glad of, and that they had come to me and had bottled porter and sandwiches on the road. Mr. Dick was so very complacent, sitting at the foot of the bed, nursing his leg, and telling me this, with his eyes wide open and a surprised smile, that I'm sorry to say I was provoked into explaining to him that ruin meant distress, want, and starvation. But I was soon bitterly reproved for this harshness by seeing his face turn pale, and tears course down his lengthened cheeks, while he fixed upon me a look of such unutterable woe that it might have softened a far harder heart than mine. So Davy is asking what happened, and Mr. Dick doesn't know. He just says, "I don't know. The other day she came to me and said, 'We're ruined.'" And I said, "Oh, okay." And then we came here to see you, because he thinks like a child. He doesn't really understand. But this made Davy angry because he had this smile on his face. "We're ruined." So Davy says, "That's a horrible thing. It means there's no money. You won't have any food. You have nowhere to live." And so he started crying and crying. And suddenly Davy felt horrible that he had told him all of this. I took infinitely greater pains to cheer him up again than I had taken to depress him. And I soon understood, as I ought to have known at first, that he had been so confident merely because of his faith in the wisest and most wonderful of women, and his unbounded reliance on my intellectual resources. The latter, I believe, he considered a match for any kind of disaster, not absolutely mortal. "What can we do, Trotwood?" said Mr. Dick. "There's the memorial." "To be sure there is," said I. "But all we can do just now, Mr. Dick, is to keep a cheerful countenance." Remember, countenance is how you look, your face. Look happy. "And not let my aunt see that we are thinking about it." He assented to this in the most earnest manner, and implored me, that's like begging, "Please, if I should see him wandering an inch out of the right course, to recall him back by some of those superior methods which were always at my command." But I regret to state that the fright I had given him proved too much for his best attempts at concealment. All the evening his eyes wandered to my aunt's face with an expression of the most dismal apprehension, as if he saw her growing thin on the spot. We've seen that expression before, on the spot. It means right at that moment, right in that place. So Mr. Dick is already seeing her starving to death. He was conscious of this, and he put a constraint upon his head. But his keeping that immovable and sitting rolling his eyes like a piece of machinery did not mend the matter at all. Mending means fixing. I saw him look at the loaf at supper, which happened to be a small one, as if nothing else stood between us and famine. And when my aunt insisted on his making his customary repast, I detected him in the act of pocketing fragments of his bread and cheese, and I have no doubt for the purpose of reviving us with those savings when we should have reached an advanced stage of attenuation. So Mr. Dick isn't eating like normal. Instead, he's taking the food and putting it in his pockets when nobody's looking, because he thinks they're all going to starve to death. My aunt, on the other hand, was in a composed frame of mind. When you're composed, that means you don't show your emotions. So if you're very worried and depressed, you don't show it. You just act normal. She was extremely gracious to Peggotty, except when I inadvertently called her by that name, and strange as I knew she felt in London, appeared quite at home. She was to have my bed, and I was to lie in the sitting-room to keep guard over her. She made a great point of being so near the river in case of a conflagration, and I suppose really did find some satisfaction in that circumstance. Well, let's look up the word conflagration. His aunt has this fear that all of London is going to burn down. Conflagration. So whenever she's in London, she's always worried and looking out the window and listening for fire alarms and things like that. A conflagration is an extensive fire which destroys a great deal of land or property. "Trot, my dear," said my aunt, when she saw me making preparations for compounding her usual night draught. "No." "Nothing, aunt? Not wine, my dear. Ale." "But there is wine here, aunt, and you always have it made of wine." "Keep that in case of sickness," said my aunt. "We mustn't use it carelessly, Trot. Ale for me, half a pint." I thought, Mr. Dick would have fallen insensible. My aunt. Every night his aunt takes a glass of wine and a piece of toast, and she dips the toast in the... That sounds really gross, but she dips the toast in the wine, and then she eats it. But I guess wine is too expensive, so she's saying ale. Ale is like beer. So she's saying, no, keep the wine for something in case you get sick or you need it for something. I'll just use beer. And everybody's completely shocked by this. I thought Mr. Dick would have fallen insensible. My aunt being resolute, I went out and got the ale myself. As it was growing late, Peggotty and Mr. Dick took that opportunity of repairing to the chandler's shop together. I parted from him, poor fellow, at the corner of the street, with his great kite at his back, a very monument of human misery. My aunt was walking up and down the room when I returned, crimping the borders of her nightcap with her fingers. Crimping is maybe going like this. And it's not so much this is like grabbing, but crimping is kind of like a wavy motion. So the emphasis is on the shape that it's making. I warmed the ale and made the toast on the usual infallible principles. When it was ready for her, she was ready for it, with her nightcap on, the skirt of her gown turned back on her knees. "My dear," said my aunt after taking a spoonful of it, "it's a great deal better than wine. Not so bilious." What is bilious? Affected by or associated with nausea. So maybe she's saying it's softer than wine. I suppose I looked doubtful, for she added, "Tut, tut, child. If nothing worse than ale happens to us, we are well off." "I should think so myself, aunt, I'm sure," said I. "Well then, why don't you think so?" said my aunt. "Because you and I are very different people," I returned. "Stuff and nonsense, Trot," replied my aunt. My aunt went on with a quiet enjoyment, in which there was very little affectation, if any, drinking the warm ale with a teaspoon and soaking her strips of toast in it. So she appears to be enjoying herself, and he's saying it didn't seem affected, meaning it looked authentic. It didn't look like she was just trying to look brave. She actually was really enjoying herself eating her ale and toast. "Trot," said she, "I don't care for strange faces in general, but I rather like that Barkis of yours. Do you know?" "It's better than £100 to hear you say so," said I. "It's a most extraordinary world," observed my aunt, rubbing her nose. "How that woman ever got into it with that name is unaccountable to me. I would be so much more easy to be born a Jackson or something of that sort. One would think." "Perhaps she thinks so too. It's not her fault," said I. "I suppose not," returned my aunt, rather grudging the admission. "But it's very aggravating. However, she's Barkis now. That's some comfort. Barkis is uncommonly fond of you, Trot." Grudging means, in this case, what it means is she has to admit something even though she doesn't want to. So Davy's saying it's not her fault her name is Peggotty, and his aunt's like, "Nah, I guess." She still wants to continue hating that, but she can't really think of a good reason. So she has to grudgingly agree with Davy on that. "There's nothing she would leave undone to prove it," said I. "Nothing, I believe," returned my aunt. "Here, the poor fool has been begging and praying about handing over some of her money, because she's got too much of it. A simpleton." My aunt's tears of pleasure were positively trickling down into the warm ale. "She's the most ridiculous creature that was ever born." So Peggotty, it seems, she's actually not doing so bad. Her husband left her some pretty good money, and I think Peggotty has offered to help give some money to the aunt, which is a huge insult to the aunt. But the aunt is actually crying, saying, "What an idiot for doing that!" But I mean, she understands it's coming from a good place. "I knew from the first moment when I saw her with that poor, dear, blessed baby of a mother of yours that she was the most ridiculous of mortals. But there are good points in Barkis." Affecting to laugh, she got an opportunity of putting her hand to her eyes. Having availed herself of it, she resumed her toast and her discourse together. "Ah, mercy upon us," sighed my aunt. "I know all about it, Trot. Barkis and myself had quite a gossip while you were out with Dick. I know all about it." I think she's talking about Dora. "I don't know where these wretched girls expect to go to, for my part. I wonder they don't knock out their brains against mantelpieces," said my aunt, an idea which was probably suggested to her by her contemplation of mine. "Poor Emily," said I. "Oh, don't talk to me about poor," returned my aunt. "She should have thought of that before she caused so much misery. Give me a kiss, Trot. I'm sorry for your early experience." As I bent forward, she put her tumbler on my knee to detain me and said, "Oh, Trot, Trot. And so you fancy yourself in love, do you?" "Fancy, aunt," I exclaimed, as red as I could be. "I adore her with my whole soul." "Dora, indeed," returned my aunt. "And you mean to say the little thing is very fascinating, I suppose?" "My dear aunt," I replied, "no one can form the least idea what she is." "Ah, and not so silly," said my aunt. "Silly, aunt." I seriously believe it had never once entered my head for a single moment to consider whether she was or not. I resented the idea, of course, but I was in a manner struck by it, as a new one altogether. "Not light-headed," said my aunt. "Light-headed, aunt." I could only repeat these daring speculation with the same kind of feeling with which I had repeated the preceding question. "Well, well," said my aunt, "I only ask. I don't depreciate her, poor little couple. And so you think you were formed for one another and are to go through a party supper table kind of life, like two pretty pieces of confectionery, do you, Trot?" So the aunt is saying, so you think you two are just going to get married and have a perfect, wonderful little life. Isn't that what you think? She asked me this so kindly and with such gentle air, half playful and half sorrowful, that I was quite touched. "We are young and inexperienced, aunt, I know," I replied, "and I dare say we say and think a good deal that is rather foolish. But we love one another truly, I'm sure. If I thought Dora could ever love anyone else, or cease to love me, or that I could ever love anybody else, or cease to love her, I don't know what I should do. Go out of my mind, I think." "Ah, Trot," said my aunt, shaking her head and smiling gravely. "Blind, blind, blind." "Someone that I know, Trot," my aunt pursued after a pause, "though of a very pliant disposition, has an earnestness of affection in him that reminds me of poor baby. Earnestness. Is that what somebody must look for to sustain him and improve him, Trot? Deep, downright, faithful earnestness?" "If you only knew the earnestness of Dora, aunt," I cried. "Oh, Trot," she said again, "blind, blind," and without knowing why, I felt a vague unhappy loss, or want of something overshadow me like a cloud. "However," said my aunt, "I don't want to put two young creatures out of conceit with themselves, or to make them unhappy, so, though it is a girl and boy attachment, and girl and boy attachments very often, mind, don't say always, come to nothing, still we'll be serious about it and hope for a prosperous issue one of these days. There's time enough for it to come to anything." So the aunt is saying, well, I'm against these things, but maybe somehow it's going to work for you two. It never does, but maybe for you two it will, so I'll try to support you. This was not upon the whole, very comforting to Rapturous lover, but I was glad to have my aunt in my confidence, and I was mindful of her being fatigued, so I thanked her ardently for this mark of her affection, and for all her other kindnesses towards me, and after a tender good night, she took her nightcap into my bedroom. How miserable I was when I lay down, how I thought and thought about my being poor, in Mr. Spenlow's eyes, about my not being what I thought I was, and when I proposed to Dora, about the chivalrous necessity of telling Dora what my worldly condition was, and releasing her from her engagement if she thought fit. about how I should contrive to live during that long term of my articles, when I was earning nothing, about doing something to assist my aunt, and seeing no way of doing anything, about coming down to have no money in my pocket, and to wear a shabby coat, and to be able to carry Dora no little presents, and to ride no gallant greys, and to show myself in no agreeable light, sordid and selfish as I knew it was, and I was tortured, and as I tortured myself by knowing that it was. To let my mind run down on my own distress so much, I was so devoted to Dora that I could not help it. I knew that it was base in me not to think more of my aunt and less of myself, but so far selfishness was inseparable from Dora, and I could not put Dora on one side for any mortal creature. How exceedingly miserable I was that night. So Davy's now going to bed thinking, well, when I proposed to Dora, I kind of had a future, and a nice bright future, but now I don't have any future. I definitely don't have any money. I have to go to her now and tell her I'm broke, I'm poor, and I understand that when you agreed to marry me, you thought I was going to have money, or that I did have money. So, if you want to say no, I understand. If you want to reject me now, I understand. So he's brokenhearted about that, and he knows that I don't think that Mr. Spenlow would have ever agreed to the marriage anyway, because they're very different levels. But now it's absolutely out of the question that they would get married, that Mr. Spenlow would agree to it. So he's feeling very sad and depressed about that. But he's also feeling guilty because really he feels like he should be focusing on his aunt who's going through this horrible time. But all he can do is think of his own sadness and disappointment in the situation. As to sleep, I had dreams of poverty in all sorts of shapes. But I seemed to dream without the previous ceremony of going to sleep. Now I was ragged, wanting to sell Dora matches, 6 bundles for halfpenny. So he's having these dreams when he's going to sleep, or as he's going to sleep, imagining walking down the street all dirty and homeless, and then he goes to sell this woman something in the street, and it's Dora. So he's having these horrible fantasies. Now I was at the office in a nightgown and boots, remonstrated by Mr. Spenlow on appearing before the clients in that airy attire. Now I was hungrily picking up the crumbs that fell from old Tiffy's daily biscuit, regularly eaten when St. Paul struck 1. Now I was hopelessly endeavoring to get a license to marry Dora, having nothing but one of Uriah Heep's gloves to offer in exchange, which the whole Commons rejected, and still, more or less conscious of my own room, I was always tossing about, like a distressed ship in a sea of bedclothes, tossing and turning. That's, if you sleep and you're not comfortable, you move around like this. This is tossing and turning in bed, or tossing and turning in your sleep. My aunt was restless too, for I frequently heard her walking to and fro, 2 or 3 times in the course of the night, attired in a long flannel wrapper, in which she looked 7 feet high. She appeared like a disturbed ghost in my room, and came to the side of the sofa on which I lay. On the first occasion, I started up in alarm, to learn that she inferred from a particular light in the sky that Westminster Abbey was on fire. So the aunt is she just keeps looking out the window thinking everything is on fire. And to be consulted in reference to the probability of its igniting Buckingham Street, in case the wind changed. Lying still after that, I found that she sat down near me, whispering to herself, Poor boy. And then it made me 20 times more wretched to know how unselfishly mindful she was of me, and how selfishly mindful I was of myself. It was difficult to believe that a night so long to me could be short to anybody else. This consideration set me thinking and thinking of an imaginary party where people were dancing the hours away until it became a dream too, and I heard the music incessantly playing one tune, and saw Dora incessantly dancing one dance, without taking the least notice of me. The man who had been playing the harp all night was trying in vain to cover it with an ordinary-sized nightcap when I awoke, or I should rather say, when I left off trying to go to sleep, and saw the sun shining in through the window at last. There was an old Roman bath in those days at the bottom of one of the streets out of the Strand, and it may be there still, in which I have had many a cold plunge, dressing myself as quietly as I could, and leaving Peggotty to look after my aunt. I tumbled head foremost into it, and then went for a walk to Hampstead. I had a hope that this brisk treatment might freshen my wits a little, and I think it did them good, for I soon came to the conclusion that the first step I ought to take was to try if my articles could be cancelled and the premium recovered. I got some breakfast on the Heath, and walked back to Doctors' Commons along the watered roads, and through a pleasant smell of summer flowers growing in the gardens, and carried into town on hucksters' heads, intent on the first effort to meet our altered circumstances. So Davy wants to go to his boss and say, can we cancel all this? Can I get a refund? Because I don't remember, his aunt paid something like £1,000 to get him into this position, which at that time, that's like £150,000 now. So that's a lot of money. So Davy's hoping to go to Mr. Spenlow and say, I changed my mind. Can I have my money back, please? I arrived at the office so soon, after all, that I had half an hour's loitering about the Commons before old Tiffy, who was always first, appeared with his key. Then I sat down in my shady corner, looking up at the sunlight on the opposite chimney pots, and thinking about Dora, until Mr. Spenlow came in, crisp and curly. "How are you, Copperfield?" said he. "Fine morning." "Beautiful morning, sir," said I. Could I say a word to you before you go into court?" "By all means," said he. "Come into my room." I followed him into his room, and began putting on his gown, and touching himself up before a little glass he had hanging inside the closet door. "I'm sorry to say," said I, "that I have some rather disheartening intelligence from my aunt." "No," said he. "Dear me, not paralysis, I hope?" "It has no reference to her health, sir," I replied. "She has met with some large losses. In fact, she has very little left, indeed." "You astound me, Copperfield," cried Mr. Spenlow. I shook my head. "Indeed, sir," said I, "her affairs are so changed that I wish to ask you whether it would be possible, at a sacrifice on our part of some portion of the premium, of course, I put in this, on the spur of the moment, warned by the blank expression of his face, to cancel my articles." What it cost me to make this proposal, nobody knows. It was like asking a favor to be sentenced to transportation from Dora. To cancel your articles, Copperfield. Cancel? I explained with tolerable firmness that I really did not know where my means of subsistence were to come from, unless I could earn them for myself. I had no fare for the future, I said, and I laid great emphasis on that, as if to imply that I should still be decidedly eligible for a son-in-law one of these days. But for the present, I was thrown upon my own resources. I am extremely sorry to hear this, Copperfield, said Mr. Spenlow. Extremely sorry. It is not usual to cancel articles for any such reason. It is not a profession course. It is not a professional course of proceeding. It is not a convenient precedent at all. Far from it. At the same time... You're very good, sir, I murmured, anticipating a concession. Not at all. Don't mention it, said Mr. Spenlow. At the same time, I was going to say, if it had been my lot to have my hands unfettered, if I had not a partner, Mr. Jorkins... My hopes were dashed in a moment, but I made another effort. Do you think, sir, said I, if I were to mention to Mr. Jorkins... Mr. Spenlow shook his head discouragingly. Heaven forbid, Copperfield, he replied, that I should do any man an injustice, still less Mr. Jorkins. But I know my partner, Copperfield. Mr. Jorkins is not a man to respond to a proposition of this peculiar nature. Mr. Jorkins is very difficult to move from the beaten track. You know what he is. I'm sure I knew nothing about him, except that he had originally been alone in the business, and now lived by himself in a house near Montague Street, which was fearfully in want of painting, that he came very late of a day, and went away very early, and he never appeared to be consulted about anything, and that he had a dingy little black hole in his own upstairs, where no business was ever done, and there was a yellow old cartridge paper pad upon his desk, unsoiled by ink, and reported to me to be 20 years of age. Would you object to my mentioning it to him, sir? I asked. By no means, said Mr. Spenlow, but I have some experience of Mr. Jorkins, Copperfield. I wish it were otherwise, for I should be happy to meet your views in any aspect. I cannot have the objection to your mentioning it to Mr. Jorkins, Copperfield, if you think it worth while. Availing myself of this permission, which was given with a warm shake of the hand, I sat, thinking about Dora, and looking at the sunlight stealing from the chimney pots down the wall of the opposite house, until Mr. Jorkins came. Then I went up to Mr. Jorkins' room, and evidently astonished Mr. Jorkins very much by making my appearance there. "Come in, Mr. Copperfield," said Mr. Jorkins. "Come in." I went in and sat down and stated my case to Mr. Jorkins, pretty much as I had stated it to Mr. Spenlow. Mr. Jorkins was not by any means the awful creature one might have expected, but a large, mild, smooth-faced man of 60, who took so much snuff that there was a tradition in the Commons that he lived principally on that stimulant, having little room in his system for any other article of diet. "You have mentioned this to Mr. Spenlow, I suppose," said Mr. Jorkins, when he had heard me very restlessly to an end. I answered yes, and I told him that Mr. Spenlow had introduced his name. "He said I should object?" asked Mr. Jorkins. I was obliged to admit that Mr. Spenlow had considered it probable. "I'm sorry to say, Mr. Copperfield, I can't advance your object," said Mr. Jorkins nervously. "The fact is, but I have an appointment at the bank, if you'll have the goodness to excuse me." With that he rose in a great hurry and was going out the room, when I made bold to say that I feared then there was no way of arranging the matter. "No," said Mr. Jorkins, stopping at the door to shake his head. "Oh, no. I object, you know," which he said very rapidly, and went out. "You must be aware, Mr. Copperfield," he added, looking restlessly at the door again, "if Mr. Spenlow objects." "Personally, he does not object, sir," said I. "Oh, personally," repeated Mr. Jorkins, in an impatient manner. "I assure you there's an objection, Mr. Copperfield. Hopeless. What you wish to be done can't be done, and I really have got an appointment at the bank." And with that he fairly ran away. And to the best of my knowledge, it was 3 days before he showed himself in the Commons again. Being very anxious to leave no stone unturned, I waited until Mr. Spenlow came in, and then described what had passed, giving him to understand that I was not hopeless of being able to soften the adamantine Jorkins if he would undertake the task. "Copperfield," returned Mr. Spenlow with a gracious smile, "you have not known my partner, Mr. Jorkins, as long as I have. Nothing is farther from my thoughts than to attribute any degree of artifice to Mr. Jorkins, but Mr. Jorkins has a way of stating his objections which often deceives people. No, Copperfield," shaking his head, "Mr. Jorkins is not to be moved, believe me." I was completely bewildered between Mr. Spenlow and Mr. Jorkins as to which of them really was the objecting partner, but I saw with sufficient clearness that there was obduracy somewhere in the firm, and that the recovery of my aunt's £1,000 was out of the question. What is obduracy? Refusing to change your mind. In a state of despondency, I remember with anything but satisfaction, for I know I still had too much reference to myself, though always in connection with Dora, I left the office and went homeward. I was trying to familiarize my mind with the worst, to present myself the arrangements we should have to make for the future in their sternest aspect, when a hackney chariot coming after me and stopping at my very feet occasioned me to look up. A fair hand was stretched forth. This was stretched forth to me from the window, and a face I had never seen, out of a feeling of serenity and happiness, for the moment when it first turned back, and the old oak staircase with the great broad balustrade, and when I associated its softened beauty with the stained glass window of the church, was smiling on me. "Agnes!" I joyfully exclaimed. "Oh, my dear Agnes, of all people in the world, what a pleasure to see you!" "Is it indeed?" she said in her cordial voice. "I want to talk to you so much," said I. "It's such a lightening of my heart only to look at you. If I had had a conjurer's cap, there is no one I should have wished for but you." "What?" returned Agnes. "Well, perhaps Dora first," I admitted with a blush. "Certainly Dora first, I hope," said Agnes, laughing. "But you next," said I. "Where are you going?" She was going to my rooms to see my aunt. The day being very fine, she was glad to come out of the chariot, which smelt, I had my head in it all this time, like a stable put under a cucumber frame. I dismissed the coachman. I told him to go away, and she took my arm, and we walked on together. She was like hope embodied to me. How different I felt in one short minute, having Agnes at my side. My aunt had written her one of the odd, abrupt notes, very little longer than a banknote, to which her epistolary efforts were usually limited, and she stated therein that she had fallen into adversity, and was leaving Dover for good, but had made up her mind to do it, and so well that nobody need be uncomfortable about her. Agnes had come to London to see my aunt, between whom and herself there had been a mutual liking these many years. Indeed, it dated from the time of my taking up my residence in Mr. Wickfield's house. She was not alone, she said. Her papa was with her, and Uriah Heep. And now they are partners, said I. Confound him. Yes, said Agnes, they have some business here, and I took advantage of their coming to come too. You must not think my visit all friendly and disinterested, Trotwood, for I am afraid I may be cruelly prejudiced. I do not like to let Papa go away alone with him. Does he exercise the same influence over Mr. Wickfield still, Agnes? Agnes shook her head. There's such a change at home, she said, that you would scarcely know the dear old house. They live with us now. They? Said I. Mr. Heep and his mother. He sleeps in your old room, said Agnes, looking up into my face. I wish I had the ordering of his dreams, said I. He wouldn't sleep there long. I keep my own little room, said Agnes, where I used to learn my lessons. How the time goes, you remember? The little panelled room that opens from the drawing room. Remember, Agnes, when I saw you for the first time coming out that door, with your quaint little basket of keys hanging at your side. It is just the same, said Agnes, smiling. I'm glad you think of it so pleasantly. We were very happy. We were indeed, said I. I keep that room to myself still, but I cannot always desert Mr. Heep, you know, and so, said Agnes quietly, I feel obliged to bear her company when I might prefer to be alone. But I have no other reason to complain of her. If she tires me sometimes by her praises of her son, it is only natural in a mother. He is a very good son to her. I looked at Agnes when she said these words, without detecting in her any consciousness of Uriah's design. Uriah wants to marry her. That's his dream. But she doesn't seem to know that yet. She doesn't seem to understand that. Her mild but earnest eyes met mine with their own beautiful frankness, and there was no change in her gentle face. The chief evil of their presence in the house, said Agnes, is that I cannot be as near Papa as I could wish. Uriah Heep being so much between us, and cannot watch over him. But that is not too bold a thing to say, as closely as I would. But if any fraud or treachery is practicing against him, I hope that simple love and truth will be strong in the end. I hope that real love and truth are stronger in the end than any evil or misfortune in the world. A certain bright smile, which I never saw on any other face, died away, even while I thought how good it was, and how familiar it had once been to me, and she asked me, with a quick change of expression, we were drawing very near my street, if I knew how the reverse in my aunt's circumstances had been brought about. On my replying no, she had not told me yet, Agnes became thoughtful, and I fancied I felt her arm tremble in mine. We found my aunt alone in a state of some excitement. A difference of opinion had arisen between herself and Mrs. Krupp on an abstract question, the propriety of chambers being inhabited by the gentler sex. So Mrs. Krupp, I'm not sure if this is in reference to his aunt, but she does not like the fact that the aunt is staying, I think, maybe I'm wrong. I think Mrs. Krupp probably doesn't like the aunt being there, but she thinks it's indecent that a man and a woman who aren't married, even though it's an aunt and a nephew, are sharing the same apartment. Propriety means like being decent, like being socially decent, or having the appearance of looking decent. So somebody's upset that the rooms are being shared with a man and a woman. And my aunt, utterly indifferent to spasms on the part of Mrs. Krupp, had cut the dispute short by informing the lady that she smelt of my brandy. So Mrs. Krupp is complaining, "I don't like you staying with Davy in that room. People are going to talk and say that there's something weird going on there." And Davy's aunt, she's a no-nonsense kind of person. She always says exactly what she thinks, and she says, "You smell like my nephew's brandy," implying that she's been drinking his alcohol, which she probably has, because she does that all the time. Both of the expressions Mrs. Krupp considered actionable, and had expressed her intention of bringing before a British Judy, meaning, it was supposed, the bulwark of our national liberties. My aunt, however, having had time to cool while Peggotty was out showing Mr. Dick the soldiers at the Horse Guards, and being, besides, greatly pleased to see Agnes, rather plumed herself on the affair than otherwise, and received us with unimpaired good humour. When Agnes laid her bonnet on the table and sat down beside her, I could not but think, looking on her mild eyes and her radiant forehead, how natural it seemed to have her there, how trustfully, although she was so young and inexperienced, my aunt confided in her, how strong she was indeed, in simple love and truth. We began to talk about my aunt's losses, and I told them what I had tried to do in the morning, which was injudicious, Trot. To be judicious means to make good decisions, so being injudicious means making very bad decisions. So the aunt is saying that was a bad thing to try to do today. But well meant. You're a generous boy, I suppose, I must say, young man now, and I'm proud of you, my dear. So far, so good. Now, Trot and Agnes, let us look at the case of Betsy Trotwood in the face, and see how it stands. I observed Agnes turn pale as she looked very attentively at my aunt. My aunt, patting her cat, looked very attentively at Agnes. "Betsy Trotwood," said my aunt, who had always kept her money matters to herself. "I don't mean your sister Trot, my dear, but myself. I had a certain property. It don't matter how much, enough to live on, more, for she had saved a little, and added to it. Betsy funded her property for some time, and then, by the advice of her man of business, laid it out on landed security, and that did very well, and returned very good interest, till Betsy was paid off. And I'm talking of Betsy as if she was a man of war. Well then, Betsy had to look about her for a new investment. She thought she was wiser now, that her man of business, who was not so much a good man of business by this time as he used to be. I'm alluding to your father, Agnes. She took it into her head to lay it out for herself. She took her pigs, said my aunt, to a foreign market, and a very bad market it turned out to be. First she lost in the mining way, and then she lost in the diving way, fishing up treasure, or some such Tom Tiddler nonsense, explained my aunt, rubbing her nose. And then she lost in the mining way again, and last of all, set the thing entirely to rights, she lost in the banking way. So the aunt is explaining that Agnes's father, who was her financial advisor, gave her some very good advice many years ago, and she made a lot of money because of it. But because she made so much money, she's explaining that she decided she didn't need a financial advisor, and she tried some independent investing, and she lost all of her money. But it's interesting because while she's explaining this, she also mentions, your father is not as good a financial advisor as he used to be. So that's kind of an interesting little remark that she made there. I don't know what the bank shares were worth for a little while, said my aunt. Cent per cent was the lowest of it, I believe, but the bank was at the other end of the world, and tumbled into space for what I know. Anyhow, it fell to pieces, and never Never will and never can pay sixpence, and Betsy's sixpence were all there, and there's an end of them. We're all there. Betsy's sixpence were all there, and there's an end of them. Least said, soonest mended. My aunt concluded this philosophical summary by fixing her eyes with a kind of triumph on Agnes, whose colour was gradually returning. Dear Miss Trotwood, is that all the history? Said Agnes. I hope it's enough, child, said my aunt. If there had been more money to lose, it wouldn't have been all, I dare say. Betsy would have contrived to throw that after the rest, and make another chapter, I have little doubt. But there was no more money, and there's no more story. Agnes had listened at first with suspended breath. Her colour still came and went, but she breathed more freely. So in the beginning of this story, for some reason, Agnes looked very concerned and worried and sick, and now she looks a little bit better. I thought I knew why. I thought she had had some fear that her unhappy father might be in some way to blame for what had happened. My aunt took her hand in hers and laughed. So even Davy is saying, oh, maybe Agnes thought her father had done this to her. Is that all? Repeated my aunt. Why, yes, that's all. Except... And she lived happily ever afterwards. Perhaps I may add that of Betsy yet, one of these days. Now, Agnes, you have a wise head. So have you, Trot, in some things, though I can't compliment you always. And here my aunt shook her own at me, with an energy of peculiar to herself. What's to be done? Here's the cottage. Taking one time with another will produce, say, £70 a year. I think we may safely put it down at that. Well, that's all we've got, said my aunt, with whom it was an idiosyncrasy. An idiosyncrasy is something that one person has, one unique characteristic that a person has, like a gesture or something. So if you're always doing this, this would be an idiosyncrasy. Not that anybody does that, but I don't know. I don't know if I have an idiosyncrasy. Let's see what hers is. That's all we've got, said my aunt, with whom it was an idiosyncrasy, as it is with some horses, to stop very short when she appeared to be in a fair way of going on for a long while. So his aunt had a way of saying very little when there was a lot to accomplish, I guess. That was her strange characteristic or behavior. Then, said my aunt, after a rest, there's Dick. He's good for 100 a year, but of course that must be expended on himself. I would sooner send him away, though I know I'm the only person who appreciates him, than have him and not spend his money on himself. How can Trot and I do best upon our means? What do you say, Agnes? I say, aunt, I interposed, that I must do something. Go for a soldier, do you mean? Returned my aunt, alarmed. Or go to sea? I won't hear of it. You are to be a proctor. We're not going to have any knockings on the head in this family, if you please, sir. I was about to explain that I was not desirous of introducing that mode of provision into the family when Agnes inquired if my rooms were held for any long term. You come to the point, my dear, said my aunt. They are not to be got rid of for 6 months at least, unless they could be underlet, and that I don't believe. The last man died here. 5 people out of 6 would die, of course, if that woman in Nanking with the flannel petticoat. I have a little ready money, and I agree with you. The best that we can do is to live the term out here and get a bedroom hard by. I thought it my duty to hint at this discomfort my aunt would sustain from living in a continual state of guerrilla warfare with Miss Corrupt. But she disposed of that objection summarily by declaring that on the first demonstration of hostilities she was prepared to astonish Miss Crupp for the whole remainder of her natural life. "I've been thinking, Trotwood," said Agnes diffidently, "that if you had time—" "I have a good deal of time, Agnes. I'm always disengaged after 4 or 5 o'clock, and I have time early in the morning, in one way or another," said I, conscious of reddening a little as I thought of the hours and hours I had devoted to fagging about town and to and fro upon the Norwood Road. "I have an abundance of time." "I know you would not mind," said Agnes, coming to me and speaking in a low voice so full of sweet and hopeful consideration that I hear it now. "The duties of a secretary." "Mind, my dear Agnes." This is written a little bit strangely, but I think she's suggesting that maybe he could go and earn some extra money by working for her father as a secretary. "Mind, my dear Agnes. Because," continued Agnes, "Dr. Strong has acted on his intention of retiring, and has come to live in London, and he asked Papa, I know, if he could recommend him one. Don't you think he would rather have his favorite old pupil near him than anybody else? Oh, so Dr. Strong, when Davy went to school, Dr. Strong was the person who ran the school, and he's trying to make his own dictionary. And he's moved to London and decided to devote all of his time to writing his dictionary, and now he wants to hire a secretary." "Dear Agnes," said I, "what should I do without you? You're always my good angel. I told you so. I never think of you in any other light." Agnes answered with her pleasant laugh that one good angel, meaning Dora, was enough, and went on to remind me that the doctor has been used to company himself in his study early in the morning and in the evening, and that probably my leisure would suit his requirements very well. I was scarcely more delighted with this prospect of earning my own bread than with the hope of earning it under my old master. In short, acting on the advice of Agnes, I sat down and wrote a letter to the doctor stating my object and appointing to call on him next day at 10 in the forenoon. This I addressed to Highgate, for in that place, so memorable to me, he lived, and went and posted it myself without losing a minute. Wherever Agnes was, some agreeable token of her noiseless presence seemed inseparable from the place. When I came back, I found my aunt's birds hanging, just as they had hung so long in the parlor window of the cottage, and my easy chair imitating my aunt's much easier chair in its position at the open window, and even the round green fan which my aunt had brought away with her screwed onto the window-sill. I knew who had done all of this, by its seeming to have quietly done itself, and I should have known in a moment who had arranged my neglected books in the old order of my school days, even if I had supposed Agnes to be miles away, instead of seeing her busy with them, and smiling at the disorder into which they had fallen. My aunt was quite gracious on the subject of the Thames. It really did look very well with the sun upon it, though not like the sea before the cottage. But she could not relent towards the London smoke, which, she said, peppered everything. A complete revolution in which Peggotty bore a prominent part was being effected in every corner of my rooms in regard of this pepper, and I was looking on thinking how little even Peggotty seemed to do with a good deal of bustle, and how much Agnes did without any bustle at all, when a knock came at the door. "I think," said Agnes, turning pale, "it's Papa. He promised that he would come." I opened the door and admitted not only Mr. Wickfield, but Uriah Heep. I had not seen Mr. Wickfield for some time. I was prepared for a great change in him after what I had heard from Agnes, but his appearance shocked me. It was not that he looked many years older. Though still dressed with the old scrupulous cleanliness, or that there was an unwholesome ruddiness upon his face, or that his eyes were full and bloodshot, or that there was a nervous trembling in his hand, the cause of which I knew, and had for some years seen it work. It was not that he had lost his good looks, or his old bearing of a gentleman, for that he had not. But the thing that struck me most was, that with the evidences of his native superiority still upon him, he should submit himself to that crawling impersonation of meanness, Uriah Heep. The reversal of the two natures in their relative positions, Uriah's of power and Mr. Wickfield's of dependence, was a sight more painful to me than I can express. If I had seen an ape taking command of a man, I should hardly have thought it more degrading spectacle. He appeared to be only too conscious of it himself. When he came in, he stood still, and with his head bowed, as if he felt it. This was only for a moment, for Agnes softly said to him, "Papa, here's Miss Trotwood, and Trotwood, whom you have not seen for a long while." And then he approached, and constrainedly gave my aunt his hand, and shook hands more cordially with me. In the moment's pause I speak of, I saw Uriah's countenance form itself in a most ill-favored smile. Agnes saw it too, I think, for she shrank from him. That means she went like this. So Uriah's smiling and she goes like this. She shrank from him. What my aunt saw or did not see, I defy the science of physiognomy to have made out. Without her own consent, I believe there never was anybody with such an imperturbable countenance when she chose. Her face might have been a dead wall on the occasion in question, for any light it threw upon her thoughts, until she broke silence with her usual abruptness. So Davy's saying, I don't know what my aunt was thinking. She never changes her facial expressions. Her countenance is always the same, so you never know what she's really thinking. "Well, Wickfield," said my aunt, and he looked up at her for the first time, "I've been telling your daughter how well I have been disposing of my money for myself, because I couldn't trust it to you. As you were growing rusty in business matters, we've been taking counsel together, and getting on very well. All things considered, Agnes is worth the whole firm, in my opinion." "If I may humbly make the remark," said Uriah Heep, with a writhe. Writhing is like moving like a snake. "I fully agree with Miss Betsy Trotwood, and should be only too happy if Miss Agnes was a partner." "You're a partner yourself, you know," returned my aunt, "and that's about enough for you, I expect. How do you find yourself, sir?" In acknowledgment to this question, addressed to him with extraordinary curtness. Curtness means short, so the aunt was not being pleasant. She wasn't being friendly or nice, but she had to say something. So she's using polite words, but she's using a very rude, short tone. She's being curt. Curt, short. It's practically the same word. Mr. Heep, uncomfortably clutching the blue bag he carried, replied that he was pretty well, and he thanked my aunt and hoped that she was the same. "And you, Mr. Copperfield," pursued Uriah. I hope I see you well. I'm rejoiced to see you, Mr. Copperfield. Even under present circumstances, I believed that, for he seemed to relish them very much. Oh, I believed that, for he seemed to relish them. To relish something is to enjoy something. Present circumstances is not what your friends would wish for you, Mr. Copperfield. But it isn't money makes the man, it's... I'm really unequal with my humble powers to express what it is, said Uriah, with a fawning jerk. But it isn't money. Here he shook hands with me, not in the common way, but standing at a good distance from me. So he's standing very far away from Davy, and lifting my hand up and down like a pump handle that he was a little afraid of. And how do you think we are looking, Master Copperfield? I should say, Mr. fawned Uriah. Don't you find Mr. Wickfield blooming, sir? Years don't tell much in our firm, Master Copperfield, except in raising up the humble, namely mother and self, and in developing, he added, as an afterthought, the beautiful, namely Miss Agnes. He jerked himself. Jerking is like a quick, small movement. He jerked himself about after this compliment in such an intolerable manner that my aunt, who had sat looking straight at him, lost all patience. Deuce take the man, said my aunt sternly. What's he about? Don't be galvanic, sir. I ask your pardon, Miss Trotwood, returned Uriah. I'm aware you're nervous. Go along with you, sir, said my aunt, anything but appeased. Don't presume to say so. I am nothing of the sort. If you're an eel, sir, conduct yourself like one. If you're a man, control your limbs, sir. Good God, said my aunt with great indignation. I'm not going to be serpentined and corkscrewed out of my senses. So his aunt is saying, act like a human. You're acting like a snake. Mr. Heap was rather abashed. That means shocked, as most people might have been, by this explosion, which derived great additional force from the indignant manner in which my aunt afterwards moved in her chair and shook her head as if she were making snaps or bounces at him. But he said to me, aside in a meek voice, I'm well aware, Mr. Copperfield, that Miss Trotwood, though an excellent lady, has a quick temper. Indeed, I think I had the pleasure of knowing her when I was an humble clerk, before you did, Master Copperfield. And it's only natural, I'm sure, that it should be made quicker by present circumstances. The wonder is that it isn't much worse. I only called to say that if there is anything we could do in present circumstances, mother or self or Wickfield and Heap, we should be really glad. I may go so far, said Uriah, with a sickly smile at his partner. Uriah Heap, said Mr. Wickfield, in a monstrous forced way, is active in the business, Trotwood. What he says, I quite concur in. You know, I had an old interest in you. Apart from that, what Uriah says, I quite concur in. Oh, what a reward it is, said Uriah, drawing up one leg at the risk of bringing down upon himself another visitation from my aunt. To be so trusted, but I hope I'm able to do something to relieve him of the fatigues of business, Mr. Copperfield. Uriah Heap is a great relief to me, said Mr. Wickfield in the same dull voice. It's a load off my mind, Trotwood, to have such a partner. The Red Fox made him say all this, I knew, to exhibit him to me in the light that he had indicated on the night when he poisoned my rest. I saw the same ill-favored smile upon his face, and saw how he watched me. "You're not going, Papa," said Agnes anxiously. "Will you not walk back with Trotwood and me?" He would have looked to Uriah, I believe, before replying, if that worthy had not anticipated him. "I am bespoke myself," said Uriah, "on business otherwise. I should have been happy to have kept with my friends, but I leave my partner to represent the firm. Miss Agnes, ever yours. I wish you a good day, Master Copperfield, and leave my humble respects with Miss Betsy Trotwood." With those words, he retired, kissing his great hand, and leering at us like a mask. Leering is, well, let's define leering. It's a type of looking, but, let's see. Indicating in lewd, sly, or malicious intent. So it's like looking at someone, but looking at them with, you can see that they have bad intentions. We sat there talking about our pleasant old Canterbury days. An hour or two, Mr. Wickfield, left to Agnes, soon became more like his former self, though there was a settled depression upon him, which he never shook off. For all that, he brightened, and had an evident pleasure in hearing us recall the little incidents of our old life, many of which he remembered very well. He said it was like those times to be alone with Agnes and me again, and he wished to heaven they had never changed. I'm sure there was an influence in the placid face of Agnes, and in the very touch of her hand upon his arm, that did wonders for him. My aunt, who was busy nearly all the while with Peggotty in the inner room, would not accompany us to the place where they were staying, but instead of my going, and I went. We dined together. After dinner, Agnes sat beside him, as of old, and poured out his wine. He took what she gave him, and no more, like a child. And we all three sat together at the window. The evening gathered in. When it was almost dark, he lay down on a sofa, Agnes pillowing his head and bending over him a little while, and when she came back to the window, it was not so dark, but I could see tears glittering in her eyes. I pray heaven that I never may forget the dear girl in her love and truth, and at the same time of my life, for if I should, I must be drawing near the end, and then I would desire to remember her best. She filled my heart with such good resolutions, strengthened my weakness so, by her example, so directed. I know not how. She was too modest and gentle to advise me in many words, the wandering ardor and unsettled purpose within me. That all the little good I have done, and all the harm I have forborne, I solemnly believe I may refer to her. And how she spoke to me of Dora, sitting at the window in the dark, listened to my praises of her, praised again, and rounded the little fairy figure shed from glimpses of her own pure light, that made it yet more precious and more innocent to me. Oh, Agnes, sister of my boyhood, if I had known then what I knew long afterwards. There was a beggar in the street when I went down, and as I turned my head towards the window, thinking of her calm, seraphic eyes, he made me start by muttering, as if he were an echo of the morning, "Blind, blind, blind." All right, well, that was the end of chapter 35 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Thank you for everyone who stayed and watched. Nobody asked questions today. I really wish you would ask questions if there's something you don't understand or something you want to talk about. I think that makes it more interesting than me just stopping sometimes and explaining this word or that word. Well, anyway, I keep promising to do this next night, but I always get tired. I'll try to do it tomorrow. I'll try to come back at the same time tomorrow to read chapter 36 of David Copperfield, which is entitled Enthusiasm. But thank you, everyone. I hope to see you again soon, and I hope next time you ask some questions and make some comments as we read along. Goodbye.